Hello, History 72B Winter Quarter 2023. We are about to start a new package and we are, I think, like a third of the way through. So you might check your points and make sure you have at least a third of the points that you'll want for the end. This lecture starts package C. I've called the package Sex Among the Victorians, but put the word Victorians in quotes. This is because places like the United States do not have a true Victorian era because the US was never ruled by Queen Victoria. She ruled over Great Britain and an extremely large British Empire from 1837 to 1901, but technically only Great Britain has a Victorian era. US history is periodized or broken up differently. You will, however, see the word Victorian used to describe anything from the 19th century: Victorian boots, Victorian jewelry, Victorian attitudes, etc. Rather than emphasizing why that is incorrect, I want to consider why Americans do this so often. The reason is that Britain had the largest and arguably the most powerful empire in the world in the Victorian era. The US was independent, but especially in the early part of the century, took most of their cues for things like fashion, literature, and significantly for us in this class, science, from Britain, and to a degree from Europe more broadly. The word Victorian is also used to designate prudishness and discomfort with the body. That is not entirely wrong, but as historians, we want to understand precisely why the word came to mean that and for whom exactly. This image is another way of visualizing why so many English-speaking people tend to think in terms of the Victorian era rather than, say, US presidents. On the left are English monarchs from King George III, king during the American Revolution, to Victoria. Victoria and Great Britain had an outsized influence on the world during her reign. You can see that I had to do two columns to fit in all the US presidents who served during Victoria's time on the throne. Conveniently, for this way of showing things, Victoria took the throne the same year that Andrew Jackson's presidency ended, and she died the same year that McKinley's term ended. There is an issue with lumping the period from 1837 to 1901 together in one period. Even if Victoria stayed on the throne, the world and the United States changed considerably over that time. The latter half of the 19th century is fairly close to us in time, so we should be alert to ideas that have not only left a residue in our society now, but have shaped the way that we think about the 19th century as a whole. In this lecture, we are focusing on developments in what I've called biology, the biology part of things. This really encompasses both biology and medicine, as the fields overlapped significantly early on, but started to diverge more and more approaching the 20th century. Next video, we'll look mainly at emerging fields that focused on the head or the mind. And in a third video in this package, we will be examining how Americans on the ground interacted with developments in authoritative fields like science and medicine. Note that these are thematic rather than chronological divisions. This was true to an extent in the last package as well. This can make it a bit more difficult to keep track of how developments in one theme relate in time to events in another theme. As we will be looking at overlapping parts of the 19th century for each theme, I suggest making yourself a timeline over the course of these lectures so that you can tell which developments came before which across themes. I find it helpful to line up signpost historical events next to presidents, not because I'm a political historian, but because, like Elizabeth I or Victoria, they are a useful way of identifying a span of years. I'm not great at memorizing dates or names. I remember things best when I can reason out information, which works well for things like anatomy and not so well for human behavior. I remember dates and temporal relationships best if I embed them in a network of relationships and anchor that with something that I've been thinking about in my hobby time most of my life. For me, that's clothing and the body, but it could be anything that you enjoy thinking about. that changed over the course of the 19th century. Art, music, surgical tools, sports, trains, whatever it is that you are into. I've broken this lecture into 3 parts. Each part is shorter than the one before. In the first part, we'll look at the two-sex model, or the Enlightenment idea that there were 2 and only 2 sexes, and that they differed from one another in absolutely every aspect in particular. We are particularly interested in how the assumptions behind this two-sex model influenced the way that scientists in the 1800s interpreted their new findings. In the Enlightenment, 18th century, 1700s, a feedback loop developed between science and social organization, and each affected the other repeatedly in constructions of sex, gender, sexuality. That expanded massively in the 19th century, especially in the second half of the 19th century covered by this course. I'm backing up before this course in places so that we really start to think about how scientists in different fields used marginalized bodies, meaning those least empowered in a particular social system, to advance their research. This will be an issue from here on out, so even if I don't mention it in a lecture, keep an eye out for it. For this lecture, we will be looking briefly, very briefly, at how doctors in the US used marginalized bodies to advance the field of gynecology and the prestige of the US in that field. If you are in my 17A, stay tuned in this section. We will be moving on here to see how gynecological research changed and how it did not after the American Civil War. With the development of anatomy, Europeans fit the same structures of the body into either a one-sex model based in the observation of similarities, or a two-sex model focusing on differences, real or imagined, depending on how they understood bodies and society. Ideas of bodies and society, in turn, reflected the organization of surrounding systems of power. The structures of the body did not change with the Enlightenment, but the way that scientists saw and interpreted those structures changed immensely. 19th century scientists started with the two-sex model, stressing differences, again, real or imagined, in every part of body and mind. By the 19th century, politics and society separated the roles of male and female even more sharply and more extensively than previously. Scientists in the 1800s did what their predecessors had done. They read what they discovered through the lens of their own cultural values and assumptions. As microscopy and experimental biology came into their own in the latter half of the 19th century, experiments and observations were completely guided by the assumptions of the two-sex model. Again, the idea that there were only 2 sexes, that these were distinct from one another in every conceivable way. Going into the 19th century, people in the West knew almost nothing about the way that conception occurred beyond what can be seen at the most obvious physical level of whole bodies, organs, and structures. They had never seen a human egg and had virtually no idea about fertilization at the level of gametes, meaning the reproductive cells. They knew that women had menses or periods, but had no idea how ovulation occurred or what triggered it. Once they did start to figure these things out, they made what they discovered make sense in their understanding of sex, gender, sexuality in their own historical context. Particularly when it came to fertilization, this would require a bit of convoluted and selective logic. In the mental contortions of Enlightenment thinkers, so before this class, but inherited by Victorians, a rationally organized society should reflect natural laws, but simultaneously overcome all that was bestial in nature, which conveniently meant that when scientists went looking for natural laws, what they saw reflected and justified crystallizing categories of race, sex, and gender that just happened to cast European, now designated white Anglo-Saxon, men as the pinnacle of all that nature, reason, and progress had to offer. I'm going to dissect the concept of progress in the next section of this lecture. In the Enlightenment, Linnaeus named mammals for breasts rather than, say, jaws, which are actually more reliable for grouping animals. Linnaeus also obsessed over the sex lives of heterosexual plants. Among philosophers, Rousseau insisted that women were naturally domestic creatures who should be in the home nursing and nurturing babies. Women were, supposedly, uniquely and naturally fitted for this role, but still needed Rousseau's manuals and male supervision to do it right. The passion for scientific discovery, attachment to hierarchical binaries, and a belief in progress all ramped up in the 19th century, even as ideas about nature became far more ambivalent, not downright mistrustful at times, as seen in one of the primary sources for this package. All of this is not to say that 19th century science had nothing exciting to offer. It did, but most emphatically is to say that the way that scientific discoveries were sought, viewed, and interpreted all need to be closely examined, particularly when those discoveries could be related to power dynamics justified by constructions of sex and race, and class, and increasingly the construction of nationality. Going into and through the 19th century, science was cast as precise, empirical, and objective. The cachet given to science allowed those who practiced it, scientists, to claim authority in social issues, not merely scientific ones. Within the realm of natural sciences, biology emerged as a field out of the union of descriptive natural history and physiology. Physiology had been the province of the medical profession and largely confined to the human body. Natural history had been classificatory and descriptive. The term biology was coined around 1800 and was meant to create a field dedicated to the comprehensive study of living organisms, plants and animals, hence the prefix bi or to. Human beings were included, sometimes rather uneasily, among the animals. Researchers going into the 19th century did not know exactly how ovaries, or testes for that matter, functioned. I'll do a quick catch-up on what Western science did think about gametes going into the 19th century. In 1672, de Graaf, don't worry about the date or the name, just get an idea for the shape of things, discovered the ovarian follicle. That's the yellow-looking bit. Here is one type of follicle, and these are other types of follicles around. De Graaf thought that the follicle either was or contained the egg. He did not actually see an ovum or egg cell. Don't worry about exactly what follicles are, just know that they are more easily seen than actual eggs. And store away for now the information that the type of follicle de Graaf saw, the largest and most obvious here, forms after an ovum is released, so there really is no egg in here anymore. If you are doing any medical sciences thing, the de Graafian follicle is named after de Graaf. The first biologist to actually see mammalian ova or eggs from a dog, not a human, was von Baer in 1828. So going into the 19th century, scientists figured that there was probably some sort of human egg and that it was probably in the ovary, but that was pretty much it. In fairness, we now tend to look at drawings or schematic depictions of ovaries. Aside from the idealized drawing, it is difficult to find an ovum, especially without proper staining, and even more especially when you really don't know what you're looking for. What de Graaf saw was the big follicle, the corpus luteum, meaning yellow body. When it came to male gametes in the 1670s and early 1700s, Hartsucker and Leeuwenhoek, and again, I'm saying the names not because you need to remember them here, but because some of you will recognize them as being applied to things these people are credited with discovering or inventing. Leeuwenhoek's name is now on a type of microscope. Using light microscopes, this pair showed that semen contains millions of little animalcules, what we now call sperm. Without knowing precisely what the animalcules or sperm or egg, which remember they had not yet seen, were, scientists projected charged gender roles onto gametes. For example, One idea was to liken the egg to a passive nest, where the boy or girl person compressed into an animalcule, you can see a little tiny pre-fetus here, would be deposited and fattened up before birth. So the woman had no contribution to the actual child. For many scientists, fertilization became a miniaturized version of monogamous marriage, in which the egg wife admitted a single animalcule husband and, in the language of the time, quote, did not allow another worm to enter. The passive egg and active sperm planting life and reason were then taken as justification for the separation of their human producers into domestic and public realms. We've seen this circularity of social structure read onto biological structure and then used to explain social structure before, and we will see it again. Until the mid-19th century, it was unclear exactly what the sperm did. Ideas included not just the penetration and plant life model that I've just described. Some researchers argued that the role of the weakly sperm was merely to stir other vital components. Many argued that sperm stimulated ovulation or release of an egg by the female. The last was popular, that idea of stimulating ovulation, and could be used in conjunction with the penetrate and plant life model. When de Graaf first identified the follicle in 1672, he was working with an older idea in which female orgasm was necessary for conception. It followed for him and scientists after him that the human egg, remember they hadn't actually seen an egg yet, did not appear until triggered by sexual intercourse. His error was not as off as it may seem now. In fact, in his study animal, he was correct. Follicles could only be detected in the ovaries after coitus or sexual intercourse. He was studying rabbits, and as it happens, rabbits, along with ferrets and camels apparently, are reflex or induced ovulators, meaning that sexual intercourse really does induce ovulation. Humans, however, are spontaneous ovulators, no coitus required. For the slide, I made the mistake of Googling rabbit ovulation, and I got so many adorable rabbits that I just couldn't choose an image. De Graaf was correct in what he saw, just not in his broader inferences. But those inferences fit so well with expectations that they were not heavily questioned all the way to the 19th century. In the 1840s, scientific authorities still assumed that coitally induced ovulation in mammals, including humans, was the norm. But by that time, the ideal of passionlessness, or complete lack of interest in sexual intercourse, had become the hegemonic social expectation for women. How could coitus cause women to release an egg if women were not supposed to feel anything during sex? Biologists were left explaining so-called anesthetic conception. One recent scholar noted that 19th century biologists seemed unwilling to let go of the idea that somehow the excitement of intercourse and sexual arousal was relevant to conception, even if, miraculously, women did not feel anything at all. The 19th century was a time of dissection and developing surgery in Europe. We'll get a glimpse of what was going on in the US in the third part of this lecture. As part of improving society, large teaching hospitals that served the poor formed in urban areas. You are looking on the slide at London's East End, a notoriously impoverished area in the 19th century. Hospital researchers in Europe had an almost endless supply of bodies of poor people. Autopsy gave researchers access to ovaries, human ovaries now, and not just dog or rabbit, and in many cases, these ovaries for which the sexual history of the person who possessed them was known. One example, an 18-year-old woman raised in a convent and determined to be Virgo intacta, or a virgin, will interest us in a moment here. Researchers figured out that the type of large follicle they could see formed after ovulation, meaning they knew that they couldn't find an egg in those follicles, but they could tell if an egg had been released. If sexual intercourse were necessary for ovulation, then quite simply, the ovaries of women who died virgins, like the example I brought up a moment ago, should not have those large follicles. But they did. Rather than considering that sexual intercourse with a man might not actually be necessary for ovulation in humans, 19th century doctors initially found other explanations for these exceptions to the rule. For example, unnatural gratification, in other words, masturbation, hysteria, or strong desire and excessive salacity. Salacity is meaning interest in sex. In other words, even if these women had never had penis and vagina sex with a man, they must have been getting up to something sexual. Again, it did not occur to these researchers to consider that anything other than sex with a man might trigger ovulation. To quote one doctor of the 19th century, I think it pretty evident that although semen has no share in bursting the ovarium, the high excitement which occurs during the heat of brutes in the lascivious states of the human virgin is sufficient frequently to affect the discharge of ova. There are a couple of important points in that. First, the role of male semen, not just in conception, but in ovulation, was taken to be the norm. Anything else was deviant, and women's desire was cast as unnatural and wrong. In other words, deviant. The words that appear in that quote are all negative: excessive salacity, lascivious heat, like brutes. As an aside, there were health movements intended to stop masturbation in both men and women on both sides of the Atlantic. The British tended to favor the use of lunatic asylums, while Americans tended to favor self-help methods, such as a bland diet, including Kellogg's cornflakes. No joke, that's why they were invented. Graham crackers were invented at the same period by Sylvester Graham as part of the health and self-improvement movements. But back to anesthetic conception, the social expectation of passionlessness or lack of interest in sex in good women ran head-on into the assumption that male semen must do important things to a woman's body in order for ovulation and especially for conception to take place. We see the residue of the old idea that female orgasm was necessary for conception, combined with no clear idea at mid-century of what exactly did happen at conception. What you end up with are descriptions in which, quote, the excitement of the seminal fluid produces an unusual flow of blood to the ovaria. The ensuing excitement causing a vesicle to burst and discharge albuminous fluid, presumably containing an ovum, which is picked up by erect fallopian tubes carried to the uterus, all of which happens inside without troubling the woman involved with any sort of sensation. In the words of a 20th century scholar, what emerges is a new and vastly inflated role for semen, which somehow pushes, squeezes, and otherwise excites a woman's insides, and which is able to do so without her feeling anything. An aside here, good women were expected to be passionless and to experience no sexual sensation at all, but they were also expected to be overcome by chaste romantic love. Lower-class women were assumed to enjoy sex. The penny press and sensation literature strove to combine the titillation of sexual intercourse with the inevitable punishment of bad girls, including those who were raped. If the girl were middle class in the story, she might be saved by the hero just in time, or he might be just a bit too late in order to get the sex bed in which case she would need to die. This literature promoted stereotypes about men of color as monsters, overwhelmed by lust for white women. Titillatory sex and violence were often linked in penny dreadfuls, and you're looking at that sensation literature in penny dreadfuls on the right of the red line there. If a woman had sex in these, she was expected to die tragically. You might reasonably ask if it occurred to 19th century researchers to ask women what they actually felt. The answer is no, but some women told them anyway. A passage from one 19th century standard textbook reveals the typical response of doctors and researchers to the information given to them by women. There may be a sensible impulse conveyed by the excitement into which the uterine system appears to be thrown, but as, quote, many women are apt to imagination, their reports on this matter are not to be trusted and can be of no practical concern. This is one of those cases in which we see the looping of social constructions of gender onto the body and sex. Whatever women imagined they felt was of no practical concern to authoritative constructions of sex, gender, or conception. When it came to the nitty-gritty of conception, it took cell theory, advances in microscopy, and improved staining techniques before Oskar Hartwig was able to demonstrate in 1876 that the sperm did indeed connect with the egg and that the joining of egg and sperm nuclei was fertilization. This had no effect on the expectation of passionlessness in proper Victorian women. Why was passionless so important? A partial answer to that, remember that there's always more going on than what I can give you in this class, brings us to part 2 and the development of what many historians call the cult of true womanhood, or sometimes you will hear the cult of domesticity. In this section, we will cover, most of it very superficially, passionlessness and progress, literal and figurative mothering, the use of it in empire building in Britain and the US, and the progressive reform movement in the US. Starting with the Enlightenment and continuing through the 19th century, science and medicine, as parts of science, had achieved an authoritative voice in politics and society. Ideas about how the world was or should be were centered on what was deemed to be rational or natural. At the same time, concepts of systematic linked differences were joined to a belief in progress. I'll say that part again. Concepts of systematic linked differences were joined to a belief in progress. This gets us to why I want you to question the assumption of progress in this class. Europeans and Euro-Americans doubled down on the narrative of progress in the 1800s. But to believe that things are progressing in the sense of the word is to believe that they are getting better somehow. And better tends to be judged according to power structures, values, and assumptions in place in a certain historical context. So in the Enlightenment and carrying through the 19th century, the dominant vision of progress, the one that affected the lives of most people, was based on the sets of binaries that we saw being set up in earlier lectures, which meant that Europeans and Euro-Americans judged everyone else by their own, often inconsistent rules. So these are also called chains of equivalence. If we make male, female, public sphere, private sphere opposites, and then we lump together everything that goes in one, we get male, public sphere, reason, and civilized. Then we get below the line, female, private sphere, emotion, and primitive. In this view, the Western white woman was passionless because she was so civilized. Women in other societies or in the lower classes were closer to the primitive and did unwomanly things, among them possibly enjoying sex. Bringing civilization was the justification that colonizers told themselves for why colonizing other peoples was actually a good thing for the colonized. Like any large group of people, there were some who disagreed and opposed colonization, but most British people absorbed the nationalism, racism, and sexism that permeated their society, no matter where they stood on colonization. For the British, the justification for building up an empire that colonized at least part of every continent with people on it was that they were making the world more civilized, more rational, more organized. In the eyes of most Europeans, not just the British, and most Euro-Americans, they were bringing light and progress to those less fortunate. On the ground, what they were actually trying to do in practical terms was make the colonized more obedient to Western norms, expectations, and distributions of power. The United States started colonizing lands to the west of the original 13 states pretty much right after the American Revolution. The map you are looking at shows when the U.S. claimed different regions of North America. By 1853, the U.S. had reached, more or less, the national borders that exist now in the contiguous states of North America. That means the ones touching one another, covering the continent from east coast to west coast. Settling this territory involved the displacement or death of all of the Native American groups that lived there, just as it had when the regions along the East Coast were initially colonized by the British. Now, I should make it clear, there are definitely still Native Americans, and there are ones like the Oneida who are still in the place where they occupy. But for the most part, particularly in the middle part of the country, Native Americans were displaced. By the late 19th century, the U.S. had expanded overseas and included islands such as Puerto Rico and Hawaii. The American justifications for colonization were basically the same as the British, but with one slight twist. In dominant American culture through the 19th century, the idea of progress became linked to religion, and specifically to millennialism, or sometimes you'll hear millenarianism, and you can see why I don't use that version. The millennial here had nothing to do with generations, but rather with 1,000 years in the apocalypse, the end of the world. Many different Protestant groups in the US believed in millennialism to some degree, especially in the period before the Civil War. For them, the idea was that progress would lead to perfection, and with perfection would come the end of times and a golden age for those who had accepted God and Jesus. Remember, there's lots of variability, so not all people believed this, but many people with power and influence did to some degree or another. In the US, both colonial expansion and projects to reform people already in the United States were intended to make things better, as defined by hegemonic values. The idea was to speed up progress, reach perfection, to usher in judgment and the end of times as quickly as possible. Belief in the literal end of times tapered out by the late 19th century, but the urge to reform, to perfect, to create progress stayed. You are looking at the painting by John Gass done in 1872 that we discussed previously. The painting is literally called American Progress, and you can see Columbia here bringing light to darkness, chasing away the primitive so-called primitive peoples and bringing the technology of civilization with her. And if you look closely, you can see on her forehead here, the Star of Empire. It was called the Star of Empire. The construction of true womanhood was built into these projects of domination. The fact that true womanhood was unattainable to pretty much all real women was, in a way, the point. The beginnings of the model linking proper womanhood to motherhood and the domestic sphere began in the Enlightenment, in other words, in the 1700s. But this was developed to such extremes in the 19th century that many historians refer to the model as the cult of true womanhood. A true woman was supposed to be married, and to a husband who earned enough money that they could have a house. She must have children once married, and those children should be well behaved and attractive at all times. She should make certain that the home was a comfortable refuge when the husband came home from the stresses and hurly-burly of the public sphere. She must be nurturing and supportive to children and husband, but never to the point of being overindulgent to the children or too cloying with the husband. Ideally, she should be educated and talented enough that the husband could take pride in having her for a wife, but not so much that she upstaged him in anything, particularly anything intellectual. Her marriage should be built on true love, the ideal of the Romantic era, so the true woman should love her husband deeply and unconditionally. But she still had to be passionless and not behave in a primitive animalistic manner. Sexual intercourse only with her husband, only he could initiate intercourse, and she should acquiesce on demand, but without any physical pleasure or unseemly enthusiasm. Mistresses and sex workers, by the way, were a different story. They were expected to express pleasure and enthusiasm, whether they felt it or not, and they could never be true women. To be honest, for many middle and upper class wives, the lack of enthusiasm and pleasure may have been quite genuine. Husbands were not expected to do anything that might make sexual activity enjoyable for their wife. Lady Hillingdon, whom you see pictured on the slide, is famously supposed to have said, "When I hear his," meaning my husband's, "steps outside my door, I lie down on my bed, open my legs, and think of England." While this story may be apocryphal, meaning that it may not actually have happened, it expresses the reality that for any woman actually trying to live up to the standard of true womanhood, sex could not have been much fun, even if she were attracted to men, and even if she truly loved her husband. Remember, all people and couples were individual and variable, but that they were all working within a common ideology, and they had to make their peace with that. Guilt was a big thing for women, meaning some of them did enjoy sex, and they felt bad about it. Of course, the requirements of true womanhood excluded women who were not white and middle to upper class right away, which meant that these women, women of color, poor women, did not count as actual women, which is why they could be colonized or enslaved or required to do 12 to 18-hour shifts in factories. In the last bit of this lecture, I will give two examples that show what the dangers of not being considered quite a real woman could be when it came to medicine. And the reason there's a rose on this slide with Lady Hillingdon is that the rose is named after her. The standards of true womanhood were also complex enough that most privileged white women could not live up to them. They counted as women, but if they overstepped their boundaries too much, like by reading or speaking, they could always be put in their place by pointing out where they failed to live up to the ideal of true womanhood. Nevertheless, the ideal of true womanhood was used to justify colonizing projects, as white women were supposed to provide a special civilizing influence because of their mothering, nurturing ways. Some white middle to upper class women were able to use the idea of true womanhood to create spaces for themselves other than a husband and a home. They made places and careers for themselves outside the private domestic sphere. As I just pointed out, the ideal of true womanhood meant that white women were considered a civilizing force because of their maternal nurturing characters, which they had because they were white. So some women suggested that their mothering skills could surely be better devoted to civilizing and reforming the world rather than marrying and having their own children. You'll notice in the pictures that Slessor, Mary Slessor was a missionary to Nigeria. You will notice that she's shown with children and not with adults. This pattern emphasized the maternal role of white women and infantilized entire groups of people by suggesting that they were all childlike regardless of age. Missionaries and educators who went to foreign countries used this logic, but so did some women in the US. Women who devoted their lives to trying to improve the lives of others maintained that they could devote their mothering skills to the sort of reforms that would make society better, more perfect. The fact that this meant they were able to build careers for themselves and that they were able to avoid heterosexual marriage and having children of their own, they cast that not as a failure of true womanhood in this logic, but as the ultimate sacrifice. You are looking in these pictures at Jane Addams, she's here, and Mary Rosette Smith. Jane Addams is one of the more famous reformers who worked to bring things like education and garbage collection to poor immigrant neighborhoods in Chicago. So some of these reformers meant well, and they did make material improvements in the life of immigrant people who were in tough neighborhoods. The picture on the left is from the late 1800s. The one on the right is from the 1920s. Adams and Smith lived together for 40 years. Adams and Smith loved one another in whatever way you want to conceive of that. We, of course, don't know about their home life, but we do know about their constant devotion. These are the types of women who used the ideal of true womanhood to escape the cult of true womanhood. We'll come back to women reformers a bit in later lectures. For the last part of this particular lecture, I'd like to go back to the authoritative realms of science and medicine, in other words, the male realms of science and medicine, and examine how they benefited from the types of women who were often the objects of reform projects, both abroad and within U.S. political borders. These educated white men targeted women who could never be true women because they were not white or because they were poor, sometimes because they were both. England made a number of discoveries about the human ovary because doctors and researchers at teaching hospitals had full access to the bodies of the poor women when they died. For the development of gynecology in the United States, I will tell you briefly about the use of the bodies of living women. I will be touching on two regions of the U.S., the South and the North. If you took my 72A, you heard about the South at the end of the quarter, but you haven't heard about the North yet. The U.S., as you know, changed considerably through the 19th century in ways that went beyond geographic expansion. We saw some developments in communication, the telegraph, and transportation, the railroads earlier in this lecture with Gast's American Progress painting. Along with this, industrial production developed, mainly clustered in the Northeast and Great Lakes region. We talked about that with immigration from Europe. Industrial production developed rapidly, and factories needed human labor. Industrial production also grew across Europe, but most wealthy European countries already had a ready workforce of desperately poor people. As people in Europe with wealth built factories, they pushed poor people who had gotten by farming off the land, so there was no way to get by. Not unlike if you've taken one of the classes that covers an earlier period, enclosure in the early modern, but on a vastly larger scale. As we have seen, those people, the ones displaced, began immigrating to the U.S. in large numbers. Cities grew up around factories as laborers settled into cramped buildings close to their work. Unlike the North, the South pretty much continued as it had started in the original Chesapeake colonies. Plantations grew ever larger and crops shifted from tobacco to cotton and rice, but it was still an agrarian world. Until the end of the Civil War in 1865, these plantations still depended on an enslaved workforce. Both regions, North and South, had people who were vulnerable because they fell on the wrong side of the ways power was constructed in that time and in those places. Please note that I am absolutely not drawing any equivalency between urban wage labor and enslavement. I am pointing out that the marginalized people in different regions whose bodies, alive or dead, were vulnerable to the experiments of 19th century white American doctors and scientists. If you took 72A with me, you have seen the vulnerability of marginalized bodies, meaning those not on the upper ends of vectors of power, in this series of courses before. In early modern colonial Virginia, Thomasine Hall had a body that was neither clearly male nor clearly female, and they were required by legal dictates to mark their physical ambiguity with clothing. You will see the vulnerability of marginalized bodies in the reading for this lecture as well. Between the early modern period and the 19th century, there was a shift in the treatment of sexually ambiguous bodies from being a legal issue to be punished to a medical issue to be studied and corrected. Both law and medicine supported the systems of power already in place, and neither one was at all friendly to those who were marginalized in any way. In the early modern period with the Thomasine case, Hall was not permitted to decide their own gender presentation. Others would decide it for them. And although some people did ask them their preference, the answer that Hall actually preferred, to live as whichever gender filled their own needs at the time, was absolutely not an option. The doubt and ambiguity embodied by Hall threatened the assumptions that underlay systems of power, so they had to be legally named, labeled, and made safe. That would be the people, not the systems of power. Because Hall did not fit the norm, most of the people around him felt entitled to conduct invasive personal examinations of Hall's body. This is on the right, a recent 2020 drawing of what Hall's mixed clothing might have looked like. To me, the collar looks above Hall's status in life, but this was the only one that I found, and it's good enough. If you've done the reading for this lecture package, then you've seen a 19th century example of a person with a marginalized body being expected to submit themselves completely to those in power. Once again, bodies that did not fit the assumptions that supported differential access to power in the 19th century, including the assumption that sex was a clear binary, still appeared as a threat, as they had in the early modern period. But in the 19th century West, meaning the Western world, not the West of North America, these bodies had become a medical issue. Ambiguous bodies were controlled by labeling the person as an accident of nature, an oddity that should be explained away and possibly fixed by doctors and researchers. Medicine and anything passed off as scientific inquiry were privileged in Western Europe and the United States. The paper for this lecture makes clear that the person whose sex was being decided by the authority of medical doctors was subject to physically painful and emotionally distressing invasions of their person without any real possibility of refusal. The image here is an ordinary patient being got ready for surgery, but it gives you an idea of the kind of gathering of 19th century doctors around an individual who is as much an object to be studied as a human patient. Cases of sex-ambiguous people have been popular among historians because they provide such a clear example of the assumption being threatened, male and female, as clearly a distinct binary. We know that huge numbers of people have been marginalized, not just those who are sexually ambiguous. The study of these people as if they were not quite human was not only in the 19th century, but through the 20th, although we won't talk about it until later. It was a way of signaling and enforcing their lower status. Doctors did not usually think, and certainly did not say, I am going to demonstrate that this group is lower status and that I can keep them there so they aren't a threat. But rather, I can use these people to study for the good of superior groups of people and make the world better for everyone. You should be able to see how that fits with the me colonizing you is good for you because I will let you share a bit of my awesomeness whether you want it or not, civilization discourse of the era. Gynecology advanced in the US in the 19th century because researchers made use of marginalized bodies that conformed to the expectation of female bodies in form for the researchers, but for whom the hegemonic idea of true womanhood was not a possibility for the researchers. In the first half of the 19th century, the doctor who would be dubbed the father of modern gynecology experimented on the enslaved women that he and his neighbors considered their property rather than people. These women underwent repeated surgeries without anesthesia so that the male doctor could test out different surgical techniques. The surgeries were often carried out before an audience of white men. The same enslaved women served as patients, nurses, and surgical assistants, but they are not called the mothers of modern gynecology. The image on the left is the most familiar through the 20th century. The image on the right is recent. In the image on the left, Anarcha, the individual being operated on or about to be operated on, is shown impassive. Other enslaved women peep around the corner of the sheet. As in missionary images, this casts them as children and denies the real work that they did as nurses. In the image on the right, the three women are presented as real people with fear and genuine human touch meant to reassure in the face of pain. The tormentors look pretty much the same, but they are moved to the background, a threatening presence moving in on their victim. In the second half of the 19th century, after the American Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments, this gynecological research shifted from the South to the urban North. Poor Irish immigrant women worked in factories and were vulnerable to the doctor they went to for post-pregnancy issues. Once again, the doctor's stated purpose in experimenting on these women was the noble goal of helping mankind, and I am deliberately saying man and not humankind there. The fact that a successful surgery sent the woman back to working for starvation wages in the factories was just a bonus. There were many levels of motivation and function for these surgical experiments. In the most local sense, the original purpose of the surgeries had been to turn enslaved women injured by repeating pregnancies back into productive laborers. In the biggest pictures, researchers did develop methods of surgery that could repair bodies damaged in childbirth. But the fact that these surgical experiments could happen at all served to reinforce vectors of power based on intersecting categories, including race, sex, status, and class. They demonstrated the power of white male doctor scientists without them saying, "I'm going to demonstrate my power now." Instead, the researchers came up with all sorts of reasons that they could experiment on these women, but they all pretty much boiled down to they are not true women. The real power of the construction of true womanhood lay less in the expectation that some women would follow it than in the reality that most women could not. The gynecological experiments benefited the male researchers immediately by raising their status, but in a more broad sense, the existence of these surgical experiments was both made possible by and reinforced the constructions used to organize power in the 19th century United States. Key points for Lecture 12. In the 19th century, biology and medicine became high prestige fields, still, with few exceptions, open only to white men with enough money for an education. All discoveries were interpreted through the lens of an absolute sexual binary that reflects social roles and rules. I have it typed the opposite way, rules and roles. Women and their gametes were assumed to be passive and passionless. Men and their sperm were described as active and full of vitality or life. The construction of idealized true womanhood was not just about the strict sex binary of the 19th century. It was also deeply tied to ideas about race, class, and nationality. Only white middle to upper class women were assumed to exist anywhere close to true womanhood. Poor women and women of color were interpreted as being not quite true women and therefore were denied whatever respectful treatment, such as it was, that might be given to true women. Even for most privileged white women, the requirements for true womanhood were so unreasonable and contradictory that any woman could be criticized for failing to live up to them. The cult of true womanhood shaped the bodies and behavior of women and men at all levels of society. Europeans and Euro-Americans justified colonization with the claim that they were helping the colonized areas develop a higher level of civilization. In this context, white women were presented as a uniquely civilizing force. Some middle and upper class women used the idea of true womanhood to carve out reform careers for themselves. Middle and upper class women justified entering the public sphere by saying that they were dedicating their unique mothering skills to society rather than a standard family of their own. People with sexually indeterminate bodies were a threat because they were living proof of the variability of sex. Some marginalized bodies could be a threat to power structures, but all marginalized bodies were vulnerable to discipline in the name of science in European and Euro-American societies, from at least the 17th century on. In early modern Europe and British America, these people were considered a legal issue, and the emphasis was on marking their gender clearly on their body through clothing or by just killing them. By the 19th century, people of indeterminate sex by European and American standards were treated as a medical issue. They were considered pathological or diseased, removed from society to be studied, cured, and identified as rare anomalies that could not threaten the existence of an absolute sex binary. I find the closing of this lecture incredibly depressing, so we are going to move on here to an aspect of true womanhood that involved performing female frailty, but was also a way to have sexually charged contact between unmarried people, in this case, heterosexual couple. These images are of young Victorian women behaving properly by being attractive and helpless, fainting delicately into the arms of a strong, protective man. Now, once women were married and had children, and especially once they were no longer a blooming flower, such behavior became silliness and was no longer acceptable. It was a very limited group that was expected to faint with aesthetic precision, and there were very limited situations in which it should happen. There was no point fainting alone in one's room unless you were likely to be quickly discovered. Notice the organization of gaze, or where the people are looking in these two images. The fainter, with her face delicately tilted away from the young man, the gallant young man gazing at her with proper concern and solicitousness, onlookers properly positioned to interpret the scene as male chivalry in the face of feminine weakness and nothing more. If you were a young woman, fainting could divert attention from a situation you did not want to deal with, meaning it could be used. If you were a young woman in proximity to a man whose attention you were okay with, strategic fainting could give you both an opportunity for close physical contact, otherwise denied to middle upper class couples before marriage. If you were a man, young or old, catching a fainting woman was an acceptable situation for either closeness or groping, depending on your character. There is a myth that Victorian women were constantly fainting because of their super tight corsets. Victorian women did not, I repeat, did not faint because of tightly laced corsets. Corsets came in different sizes and were often made to fit individual women. Most women did not tight lace. What you're looking at here is an idealized advertisement. A properly fitted corset should wrap comfortably around the body with about 2 inches between the ends when laced, and only needed to be tight enough to stay on and to support the breasts. So they didn't meet in the back, the two sides of it, and they didn't limit breathing. They just supported fleshy bits. Comfort is more than just a physical sensation, and this is why I was really excited when skirts came out. Comfort also has to do with the ease of habit, with feeling, or more to the point, not constantly feeling, one's body, because it feels like the body we know every day. I have worn a late 19th century style corset, and I probably would not want to live in it every day. But that is because my movement patterns and the world that I move in are not habituated to a corset, not because I had any trouble breathing. Ordinary women wore corsets. There were corsets marketed to maids that were designed to accommodate their movement. The bodice of the woman on the left looks stiff because the bodice itself has boning in addition to the corset. The tight fit of fashionable bodices could draw the fabric to the center at the waist. This tends to give the impression that the corset underneath is tight-laced, when, in fact, it is a function of fabric and bodice construction. These are ordinary women, all in their corsets. Again, the issue here is not comfort in some supposedly objective sense. It is that none of these women are tight-laced. They can all breathe, and none of them are fainting, and they feel perfectly normal to themselves, although dressed up nicely and having their picture taken. These are ordinary people. My favorite is the middle one with her smile and her style, and I guarantee that she is not tight-laced. So where do we get the idea that all women tight-laced? The same way that hegemonic beauty standards move back and forth between pornography and society now. Because not only did sex workers tight lace, but the fact that ordinary women did not was part of the fetish. I think that there is something called waist training now. In every pose here, the point is to draw attention to the waist, and the one on the far left makes the emphasis on tight lacing quite clear by holding her laces. The one in the middle has been altered with the late 19th century version of Photoshop airbrushing. The sides of her waist have been colored in with black ink to exaggerate the waist-hip ratio. I cannot resist juxtaposing the photoshopped photo to an image and quote from a man of the Enlightenment on the expected, not real structure of the female body. He made the skeleton and he chose it because I have always observed that the female body, which is the most beautiful and womanly in all its parts, is one in which the pelvis is the largest in relation to the rest of the body. The corset circled around through pornography and high fashion in popular culture through the entirety of the 20th century. It was always a bit risque, because if it were not, how could it be transgressive and suggestive and shocking? In other words, how could it be fetishized? This iconic photo by Horst P. Horst appeared in the 1939 issue of French Vogue. Corsets do not need to be visible to be suggestive. Horst produced many, many images for Vogue magazines. These and the images on the next slide are Horst from the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. Horst took photos that did not involve an obviously constricted waist, and Vogue ran other styles that, while featuring thin models and small-waisted fashions, were not as extreme. The obviously tight-laced waist formed a genre that carried the same suggestiveness through all decades of the 20th century, even among the nice girls of the 1950s. Dior's famous new look, you see that on the left after World War II, first introduced in 1947 and incredibly popular through the 1950s, made waists look smaller relative to the exuberant fabric-consuming skirts supported by crinolines that celebrated the end of wartime rationing. The extremely large skirts that characterized the middle third of the 19th century provided the same optical illusion. The photo on the left is another Horst. In the fashion plate on the right, it is not only the women, I'll say that again, in the fashion plate on the right, it is not only the women who have obviously constricted waists. Men also wore so-called waist constrictors, and not for sexy time reasons, but just for daily aesthetic. This 1940 Vogue cover, photographed by Horst, manages to feature a constricted waist with no corset. I was actually a bit surprised when I saw the date on this. It could easily be a fitness model from the late 1980s or the 1990s, demonstrating a Pilates teaser or yoga navasana. Speaking of the 1980s in corsetry, here is Madonna. It would be difficult to argue here that the corset is not meant to be both sexually suggestive and transgressive. The corset has become something of a Madonna trademark from the 1980s on, apparently right up to when I originally wrote this section in response to a student's question, which was a year, 2 years maybe ago. Corsets and tight lacing are currently linked not only to sex, but often to particular tastes in sexual activity. I would be surprised if any of these women regularly faints because they cannot breathe when tight-laced. I'm sorry, but it would just kind of reduce the dom thing if she fainted. Which brings us back to our original topic, which was fainting or swooning. If it wasn't due to corsets, what purpose did it serve? Hollywood went all in with the sexually suggestive, vulnerable fainting for decades, and the man as beastly and unable to control himself sexually. As in the 1800s, the fainting woman allows physical, sexually charged bodily contact between individuals who are otherwise not socially able to touch one another. And as in the 1800s, the vulnerability of the unconscious woman highlights the strength and sexuality of the man. The trope also allowed physical contact without the heroine being put in the position of actually consenting. She could still be a good girl. Fainting couches emerged from 20th century Hollywood and high fashion, not from tight-laced Victorians. This is a horsed photo. No corset or obvious waist compression, but another form of sexual suggestiveness through the unconsciousness. The implication that fainting and sexual availability were linked came from the earliest days of Hollywood. This is Louise Brooks, sex icon of the 1920s and trendsetter in hairstyles. The link that exists between fainting and corsets is not through the inability to breathe, but through sexual associations. We have the nascent film industry of the early 20th century to thank for the fainting couch, as well as for pearl clutching. Oh my,